So let's talk about zeitgeist. And are we seeing the end of the managerial state? So there was one layoff I didn't talk about in the layoffs block because I wanted to peel it off, partly because this layoff is bigger than all the other ones put together, and it's not focused on publishing the way you might think. And that is the layoffs that Amazon just announced. So Amazon is laying off not 1,400 corporate jobs, but they're laying off 14,000 corporate jobs. And these jobs are mostly in middle management. And this follows a trend of management layoffs that we're seeing across the country. And these companies tend to do these layoffs right around earnings season, sometimes right before their earnings call. And they do it to boost their stock price in part because Wall Street loves to see middle managers get laid off. Laying off, really, Wall Street loves to see layoffs in general. It's very interesting. Regular people, when we read about layoffs, our hearts go out for the people getting laid off. And we're like, gosh, it's so sad to get laid off. But a Wall Street investor reads a story about a layoff and they're like, oh, this company is going to be so much more efficient now. It's going to make so much more money. And so you tend to see company stock price go up after layoffs. So that's neither here nor there. But this is kind of the economic environment that is setting the zeitgeist for readers across the country, is this fear of getting laid off. And a good historical parallel for this economic era is the 1980s. So in the 1980s, clerical jobs made up about 20% of the US workforce. So these are people who typed and copied pieces of paper with typewriters and then filed those pieces of paper away in filing cabinets. And then when that piece of paper was required, they would go and find the piece of paper in the filing cabinet and deliver it to whoever needed it. So clerical work. And I'm describing it because I know we have people who weren't alive in the 1980s, and they have a hard time even imagining what that was, that you would have whole floors filled with filing cabinets and a whole team of people to make sure that information was stored in a way that it could be rapidly accessed when that information was needed. And what we started to see in the 1980s, and it accelerated in the 1990s, was that the people with typewriters on their desks got laid off, or they got pushed into early retirement, or when they retired, they were replaced with no one. And the people with typewriters and filing cabinets were replaced ultimately by people with personal computers and laser printers. But one or two people with a personal computer and Windows 95 could do the work of an entire secretarial pool with typewriters. Now, the very best secretaries were given those computers, but the ones who weren't at the very top were let go. And this hit older workers the hardest. So there was this concept in the 90s of the computer knowledge gap. And what we saw in the 90s was that retirement rates really spiked, and people who were older who were unable to adapt to the personal computer got pushed into early retirement, or they saw their wages go down. And this hit certain roles like bookkeepers the hardest. And the older somebody was, the less likely the company was going to invest in training you. So the older you are, the more responsible you are for training yourself. So if you're young, at least in the 90s, the companies would invest in your education. So they teach you how to type, and they teach you how to use Windows 95 and help you get more productive. But if you're nearing retirement, like, it's not worth it, was the attitude. Now, nowadays, since people don't work at companies as long, there's less training in some ways, because if somebody's only going to work at your company for 2 or 3 years, why would you want to train people who are going to work for your competitor 3 years from now? So there's some of that attitude. So I think that everyone is more responsible for their own professional training than they were in the 90s. So we're seeing this split in the economy where the old aristocracy is falling. So management jobs, a middle management job, like a vice president in charge of blah, 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 that used to be seen as a very prestigious role. Just like being an aristocrat in the 1820s was very prestigious. But the problem was with the Industrial Revolution, all of the money wasn't coming from being the landed gentry. The money was coming from owning a factory in the city. And the aristocrats didn't own factories in the city. And so while the aristocrats had status, they didn't have money. And what we saw in the 1800s is that in the UK, the aristocratic families started marrying their children to merchant families. And in the UK, and then it started happening between the Brits and the Americans. You see it in Downton Abbey, where the mom, whose money helps keep Downton Abbey functioning, is from America, and that was a very real thing. In fact, even Winston Churchill's mother was from America, so it's typically wealthy daughters of American industrialists were getting married to prestigious families in the UK. And it became such an issue that there was even talk of like passing a law to ban it, because they're like, all of our money is getting stolen by these European aristocrats. And the law didn't go anywhere, but there was some buzz about it. But a lot of those aristocrats, their children now are very poor because they failed to make the transition. I remember running into a young lady whose dad, I think, had a title. She was noble, and her dad had a title, and yet they were very poor. I mean, they were middle class, but for an earl to be middle class, he was middle class. He was upper class, but he had middle class money because his ancestors failed to make that transition. And in Silicon Valley right now, there's this new language that's emerging where they use the phrase techno kings and techno peasants. So AI is kind of nomming its way through the middle class, so that assistant to the regional manager type role or assistant regional manager role is getting replaced with AI. And so there's the techno kings who tell the AI what to do, and the techno peasants who are told by the AI what to do. And this is the difference between people who have AI as employees and people who have AI as bosses, right? So if you work for DoorDash, your boss is an AI, tells you what food to get, where, and where to take it, right? And if you see somebody delivering something to your house, they're not even looking at your house. They're looking at their phone as they're walking for your house. They're taking a picture because their computer on their phone or the AI in the cloud wants to make sure that the box was put there, right? All of the management is being handled by artificial intelligence, rather than him calling up his boss and being like, yep, I just dropped off the box at 123 Elmore Street and I'm on my way to 124 Elmore Street to drop off the next box, right? All that management is being handled by the computer. And for younger readers, they're entering this world where the high status jobs are getting laid off, and people with 20 years of management experience now can't find work anywhere. It's really rough. In fact, I have a friend who was a top manager at a top company and is now pivoting to a job that's not management at all, because there's just no one hiring people with management experience in Austin, particularly. And so if you're ever looking for work, the Border Patrol is hiring. And they pay really well and they have a signing bonus. So this is a real challenge, because the high status way to get that management job is to get $100,000 worth of debt at a university. And now getting that debt at a university is a path to techno peasanthood. In fact, the way that peasants were created was with a process called debt peonage, where you become a debt peon, where you never escape from debt. So you're not technically a slave, but because you're in debt, you're not free to leave. And a lot of people who are in a lot of debt aren't really free to quit. They're not really free to start their own business. That's why we see more businesses started by immigrants that have no debt, rather than by Native Americans or Native-born Americans, because the Native-born Americans are drowning in debt. And they're often drowning in debt because they were pressured to go to college. And so don't pressure the young people in your life to go to college. It's a trap. And pressure them to start a business instead. Money you spend on college, you could use to start a business, and then you could be a free man. You could work freelance. All right. So how do you navigate this changing landscape as an author, and how is it changing the zeitgeist in terms of the kinds of books that people are wanting to read? So there's the hard way and the easy way. So I'll share the hard way with you first. So the hard way is to use AI to become more productive. If you can do the work of 2 men, you're safer from layoffs than those who can do the work of 1 man. So the first people who are laid off are the people who are doing the work of half a man. um, but that's not totally protecting you, because when a whole department gets cut, it doesn't matter who was the most productive person in the department. So some layoffs are smart layoffs where they are trying to keep, right, the 2 secretaries who are the best secretaries that put a computer on their desk. And they say, we're going to give you a raise and you're going to do the work of 10 secretaries. So you go from 20 secretaries to 2, and the 2 remaining have a computer and can do the work of 10 men or 10 women. That's one approach, right? Where you become so productive, so good that you're not replaceable. So as an author, this means using AI to write more and better books, right? Make your books better and write them faster. This is always the path to more productivity. And you also use AI to help you reach more readers. And this is work, right? It means learning how to prompt, learning how to train, learning how to get the AI to write in your voice and to write better than what somebody could get just prompting ChatGPT in the ChatGPT window. It means investing in education. It means thinking, and it means agency. So in this AI world, one of the ways that you differentiate yourself is by having hustle and having agency and having judgment, which are things that AI really struggles with. So taking responsibility for decisions is very attractive in this new era, because AI can't take responsibility by its very nature. And so a human has to take responsibility. So even if you're using AI, you're taking responsibility for the things that you're making. That's the hard way. Now let's talk about the easy way. The easy way is to use AI as little as possible, but secretly more than the people around you. And then convince the people around you that using AI is immoral. And then you go on witch hunts to hunt down anybody using AI. So in the short term, this easy path will make you feel very virtuous. In the long term, the people you persecuted are going to become your boss. So maybe it's not a good strategy, but it is the easy path that leads to economic destruction. So Ted says, my World War II grandparents pushed kids into college because in World War II, they saw officers were all college educated and the grunts weren't. So they wanted kids to be college educated. That's true. And in that era, college was a really great investment. So my grandmother, when she went to college in the 1940s, so in this World War II era, in fact, it was during the war, a semester of the University of Texas was $25. And even if you adjust that for inflation, it's still really, really cheap compared to how much the University of Texas is today. So if you multiply that by 10, it becomes $250. And if you multiply it by 100, it becomes $2,500. That's like the cost of 2 credit hours at UT today. College has gotten so much more expensive, and the value of college has gone down. But that World War II thinking persists, and it's part of the reason why college has gotten so expensive. So one rule of thumb, if you're trying to decide if college is for you, is just don't go in debt for it. College debt is the worst possible debt because it's not absolvable in bankruptcy. So it really is like debt peonage. You can't get rid of it unless you pay it off. And a lot of people who are making the minimum payments on their college loans will never pay it off. And if you do the math and you run the numbers, in fact, it actually grows every year making the minimum payment. And because you can't absolve it, you will die with it and you will leave your descendants nothing. And so it's really wiping out wealth for a vast percentage of the population. It really is. It's a very unfortunate trap. All right, back to the zeitgeist stuff. I did a whole episode on college for novel marketing if you want to hear more. So readers are going through a very dramatic time of technological change. And this is a shift because we haven't gone through a lot of technical change recently. So since the advent of the personal computer and the internet, which both happened in the very early 90s. So basically, since I've kind of become aware technologically, there haven't been really any major technological breakthroughs. They've all been very evolutionary little steps. The one breakthrough was the phone, which didn't make us more productive. It actually made us less productive. There's a lot of people swiping on Candy Crush, and kind of, which is basically gambling. And they're just like somebody on a slot machine, just pulling the lever. The brain's not doing anything. They're not learning. They're not really consuming. Their brain's being hijacked, and it really hurts their productivity and their creativity. And by Candy Crush, I mean all of the phone apps. And I have a whole episode on phone apps and how bad they are for you. But AI is different. AI really does make people more productive and really can allow one person to do the work of 10 people, which is what we saw in the 1880s to 1920s, where electricity just completely changed the game. The electricity and the internal combustion engine and radio. There's a bunch of technological breakthroughs that all happened bang, bang, bang. And we're starting to see that, right? We're seeing quantum computing's actually starting to work now. We're seeing a lot of other big technologies we didn't know were going to happen or not are starting to hit. And it was during the 1880s to 1920s that Chesterton's fence got destroyed, right? All of civilization and most of the world got completely reinvented. And it kind of culminated in World War One, which was this just destruction of the old world. So all the old empires were destroyed. A lot of the empires were replaced with democracies, and some of the kingdoms were replaced with communism, right? So you had the czars in Russia fall to communism. And that fall to communism was very much kind of an outgrowth of this technological change and how it gave the city workers power to crush the farmers. So the hammer and the sickle is kind of false advertising. Communism, if you look at it historically, is really the hammer smashing the sickle. So it's wave after wave of the powerful people in the city stealing money from the food creating people in the countryside and creating mass starvation. And you see that like every 5 or 10 years throughout Russian history of these just massive famines because the people in the city had more power than the people in the country and would just steal their food. Saw the same thing in China. The hammer smashes the sickle. And it's why now country people are very resistant to communism. So you go out in the country, wherever you are, drive away from the city center for an hour or two and see if you can find a single person who thinks communism is a good idea. Now, on the other side, because I know most of my audience lives in suburbs, drive into the city. You get to the city center, ask the people in the center of your city if they think communism is a good idea, and they think it's great, right? New York City is about to elect a communist. And this was kind of an outgrowth of the power of the factory. So one and it's similar in some ways to the personal computer revolution that we saw in the 1980s and 2000s, particularly economically. But one very interesting thing to navigate is that historically lowering interest rates leads to job creation. So the Federal Reserve has this dual purpose: keep interest rates or keep inflation low and keep unemployment low. And typically, if you lower interest rates, it will reduce inflation but increase unemployment. But right now, the more liquidity we put into the economy, the more companies are investing in AI to replace their human workers. So now lower interest rates means fewer jobs potentially, right? So Amazon, why did they lay off 14,000 people? So they could do more AI. And that's not even a conspiracy theory. That's what they said in the press release, right? They're pivoting towards AI. They're being more nimble. It's right. They don't want these humans. They want to replace them with robots. And this is a very, this could create a lot of turbulence in the economy because the tools that the Fed has been using aren't going to work the way they have been working. And it's really easy to overcorrect. So times are really good right now economically, but the price of gold and silver is going through the roof, and those don't normally go hand in hand. So you can take that and interpret it however you want. So some other things where this is having knock-on effects. The conversation around the environment is totally changing. And I predicted this in my episode almost a year ago. On one of my very first Zeitgeist episodes, I talked about science fiction and how the conversation around climate change was going to change. And that has happened. So Bill Gates just released a paper about how he's cooling on global warming, right? He doesn't think it's as bad of a problem. He thinks we've dealt with it now. Greta Thunberg, right? She switched from environmentalism to anti-Semitism as like her issue that will get her more power. And to understand what's going on, you have to realize that inside of the environmentalist movement, you had true believers, people who really cared about the whales and the birds and the soil and the air. And then you had a lot of people who saw environmentalism as their path to power and money. And the people who were kind of skin suit wearing environmentalists, but were really just greedy, for power and money have bailed or are bailing on environmentalism because they see that AI or um, for Greta Thunberg, it's her anti-Semitism, anti-Israel stuff. But most of them are not doing the Greta Thunberg thing and going anti-Israel. They're going into AI, and AI is a better path to money and a better path to power. The reason why everyone's investing in AI so quickly is that the view amongst the elites in society right now is that whoever gets to AI first and AGI first controls the next 100 years. It's like controlling the internal combustion engine or electricity for the next era of human civilization. And so there are a lot of people who really believed what they were told on climate change, right? They believed what Bill Gates told them and what the scientists that Bill Gates paid said. And there's going to be some disillusionment. And it's like, you insisted that these things were true. Now you're saying they're not true just because you'll get more power. Now, there's not enough electricity for you to have AI. So now suddenly coal is okay. Now you want nuclear. I thought you were against nuclear, right? It's going to create some cognitive dissonance. It's going to, the environmental movement's going to need some new leaders. And who knows, maybe you could be one of those new leaders, right? Get back to the birds and the fish and the whales and the air and the soil, right? The kind of where the environmental movement started, and stop talking about carbon. So that's kind of an aside. From a zeitgeist thing, the psychological pain of not knowing how to navigate, young men who don't know what kind of job to get, who don't know how to become wealthy enough to attract a wife, and are very frustrated because the path that their parents took doesn't work for them. Right? Their grandparents are able to work their way through college. They do that, they're in debt they'll never escape from for the rest of their life. Right? You can't just work your way through college like you used to, because college is $100,000 a year, and you can't work a part-time job and make $100,000 a year. My grandmother could have worked her way through college. $25 a year in 1942 is a totally earnable amount of money. It's not anymore. And that psychological pain amongst young men is very dangerous for society. There's a saying in Africa that if young men can't find warmth in the village, they'll burn it down to stay warm. And aimless young men without jobs and without wives is one of the most destabilizing forces historically, period. Right? Who were the barbarians invading? And by this, I mean, pick your barbarians, right? And pick your civilization, right? Who was invading Han China? Who was invading ancient Greece? Who was invading Rome? It was young, restless men with no hope back home. And they were like, let's get together a band and let's go attack the wealthy civilization and see what we can steal. So all of the barbarian invasions was this, but also all of the domestic disturbances was this. The big innovation for Western civilization was monogamy, because if you allow the most powerful men to get lots and lots of women, it leaves a lot of young men with nothing. And cultures with polygamy are far more violent because the young men at the bottom of society are very violent, fighting to try to become the elites with all of the women. It's a very unstable system. And Rome, Greece and Rome, were some of the first civilizations to really make monogamy a core civilizational feature. And it was like this ultimate cheat code. So for 1,000 years, the Greco-Roman civilization defeated all of the polygamous societies that it came in contact with. Just completely blew them away. And what's happening now is that we've become polygamous again. Although we're not using the institution of marriage, but you have these alpha chads with a dozen girlfriends and a lot of soy boys who have nothing. Incels, you could call them. So amongst Gen Z, I saw some statistic. Let's see if I can remember it. 60% of Gen Z men are single, but only 30% of Gen Z women are single, which means the Gen Z women are sharing the alpha chads at the top, and that's very unstable. And Western civilization doesn't have any experience with dealing with polygamous destabilization. because it hasn't been a feature going back to the pagan Romans and the pagan Greeks, right? This isn't even a Christian thing. This isn't even a Jewish thing. Like the Greeks were monogamous back when the Jews were still having multiple wives. And from a civilizational perspective. Now you can make a religious argument that the Bible always called for one man, one woman, but I'm not talking about this theologically. I'm talking about this purely from a like civilizational software perspective. And I'm getting way off topic, and I'm way over time. Anyway, let's go check in on the chat, shall we? Felicia Ferguson says there was an MIT study showing that people who used AI to write couldn't remember what they had written a few minutes after the project was finished. How is AI helping people retain knowledge? So the way that it's helping people retain knowledge is by helping them find where that knowledge is stored. It's not helping their memories. Basically, from the time we invented writing, or invented paper, because we've had writing for a really long time. Paper and writing together, memories have been getting worse, right? Socrates was against books because he said it was going to make people's memories worse, and they're not going to be able to remember the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he wasn't wrong. And now most people don't remember very many phone numbers. Steven says, I guess paying $300,000 for that interpretive dance masters wasn't quite the investment Granny told me it would be. Yeah, and this actually is a perfect parallel to Ted's comment earlier. In fact, I'll throw Ted's comment up here. Because it didn't matter in World War II what degree you had. So if you had an interpretive dance degree, although I don't think that degree existed back then, but let's say it did, that was enough to get you eligible to become an officer potentially. But now you have a lot of college-educated sergeants and corporals and enlisted men because it's not a guaranteed path to the officership. Jeremy says, in China's countryside, Mao is still loved because of land reform. The mass starvation was mostly blamed on corrupt local officials, though it was really Mao's fault. I believe that. The central government in China is really good at exporting the blame, and particularly exporting the blame to the local governments. And they do a pretty good job, or at least they claim to do a good job, rooting out corruption in the local governments. What they don't do is a good job of rooting out corruption in the central government. Jeremy says, my father saved a lot of elementary school homework. He sent me a worksheet from 4th grade claiming that the hole in the ozone would make Argentina uninhabitable by 2002. Yeah, so actually the hole in the ozone layer was real, and we actually did solve it. In its closing. There was a certain kind of hydrocarbon that was in a certain kind of propellant that created a chemical reaction in the atmosphere, and it ended up being really easy to fix. And it was fixed under the Reagan administration. And once we understood how it worked, and once we saw that there was such a simple alternative that worked just as well, all the countries, I think every country in the world, signed whatever treaty it was to stop using whatever that harmful chemical was. And what's interesting is now that we're not using that chemical, the ozone layer is healing faster than we anticipated it would. So Gray says, I worked 3 jobs to get through college in chaos, a school, and chose a school that offered scholarships. Couldn't have done it otherwise. Yeah, there are still inexpensive schools, and there are still schools that will give you good scholarships. My wife, to brag on her a little bit, she was a National Merit Scholar. She learned to read at 3 years old and didn't pay for college. She had good enough academics that when they saw her PSAT scores and SAT scores, University of A&M was like, hey, we would love to have you, and you don't have to pay to be here. Now, the sad part of the story is, my wife will tell you, she didn't learn anything useful in that degree. It was a completely useless degree, but we're very thankful that it didn't cost her any money, that she was able to pay for it with scholarships. It made up for the fact that it didn't prepare her for the workforce. She got a communications degree where all she learned was a bunch of useless theory. And it was useless at best and wrong, anti-useful at worst. So Patricia says, yes, true, kind of prophetic with the situation this weekend, praying over our young people and those working to overpower the country. The people who decided humanity didn't need free infinite energy via nuclear power abandoned that position as soon as they realized they needed it to keep AI data centers fueled. Yeah, the pivot on nuclear was always it was very telling. And nuclear was always the way to tell if somebody really cared about carbon or not, because nuclear has no carbon output. So nuclear energy has waste, and it's a issue dealing with nuclear waste. But that waste is not carbon. That waste is radioactive. Patricia says, "Well, I'm literally 3 credits short of a dance major, but 2 architecture degrees I use in some manner or fashion." I'm not reading these ahead of time, so I'm not a very fast reader. So Naomi says, classical musicians and chess players have good memories for their field of study. Oh, Scott is like chloral fluorocarbons, CFCs. Yes. So that was the chemical that reacted with the ozone. And what it would do, if I'm not mistaken, was that it would break ozone, which is O3, I believe, and it would break it into O2, which is just regular oxygen. Ozone's either O3 or O1. I can't remember. Trying to remember chemistry live on air, and I'm going to get fact checked like crazy in the comments. The ozone was a big deal in New Zealand and Australia, slowly improving. Yes, and in fact, I've heard that there's a lot of issues with really bad sunburn down there because of the whole of the ozone layer. So Scott says, interesting, man who came up with CFCs also put lead into gasoline. He apparently always wanted to help the world. Yeah. This is one of the fears that I have. Actually, this guy's story, whose name we can't remember, but he's the lead in gasoline and the CFCs guy. I'm in a very interesting position where I'm potentially influencing authors via zeitgeist into tweaking their stories. And as authors, y'all have a lot of power over the culture that we create for ourselves. You are in the culture creation business. And any one of you could write a runaway bestseller that really changes the course of culture. And everybody wants to do that. They want their book to be that runaway book that changes culture. But maybe you shouldn't, because you might destroy Chester's hen's fence, right? That changing culture is actually something that should be done with fear and trembling and with circumspection, because putting lead in the gasoline really did make the engines run better. It really did improve gas mileage. And it really did lower the average IQ of Americans by like 5 points, right? Like kids who grew up without breathing leaded gasoline have higher IQs than the kids that didn't. And that's a real cost. And so there's this concept of the law of unintended consequences. And there's a principle that changes should be made slowly and carefully. And culture sometimes changes slowly and carefully, like what we saw with audiobooks, right? This kind of emergence of the 3 tiers of audiobooks, the mass market AI narrated books, the paperback single narration books, and then the hardback full cast narration, right? That kind of happened so slowly that this article I read predicting it is really just describing what already happened. And we're like, oh yeah, the sun came up. I didn't even notice. But other cultural changes are so sudden that in a month, you don't recognize the culture anymore. And I'll close with this. The pivot between the left and the right, that language, left and right, goes back to the French Revolution. And a lot of people think that that's where it started. But if you study the trends of history, this swinging of the pendulum goes back into biblical times. And what you'll get is this slow march of sexual promiscuity, where it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. And then there's a snap and it goes back the other way really extremely. And we see this at the end of the book of Judges. So in Judges, there's this man and he has a wife or concubine, and he's traveling home. And he stays in this town in Benjamin. This is going to get me demonetized, but straight out of scripture. And the men of that town come out and they demand to know this man who's traveling through the town. Use a biblical language to see if I can keep from getting demonetized. No, in a biblical sense. And they appease the crowd by throwing out the man's wife, who is known by the crowd to the point that she dies. And when news of this moment, so things had been getting worse and worse morally, little by little, and you see that through the story of Judges. But this moment, this one woman dying, snapped all of Israel to the point that they mustered an army of tens of thousands of men and marched on Benjamin. And so suddenly there's war. And they say to Benjamin, send out these men who did this terrible thing, and we will execute them. And the people of Benjamin said no. They approved of what happened. And they said, no, we are not going to give you these men. And for punishment, for justice. And the result was a genocide where there was no women or children of the tribe of Benjamin left at the end of that war. And there was only either 300 or 600 men left. And the Israelites, the other 11 tribes of Israel, swore an oath before God that they wouldn't let any of the surviving men of Benjamin marry any of their daughters, so that the entire tribe of Benjamin would disappear for all time. And after a year or so, or after some time, they kind of came back to their senses. And this often happens with this snap and this sudden terrible violence. And people are like, what did we do? What happened? We way overreacted, right? This is the story of history, is overreactions lead to overreactions. And they're like, we made this oath. We can't go back on our oath, but we can't let one of the tribes disappear for all time. And so they found a workaround, and they looked the other way while the men of Benjamin were able to steal wives. And the tribe of Benjamin persisted, but it didn't really. There were clans in the other tribes that had more people than the tribe of Benjamin. And the tribe of Benjamin remained small and insignificant for the rest of the biblical story. In fact, they're so insignificant that often they don't even get mentioned, right? There's the civil war between Judah and Israel. So Israel is the 10 tribes of Israel, and Judah is the tribe of Judah. Oh, and Benjamin. Oh, yeah, they're still here. They were so small and insignificant. They would go without mentioning half of the time. They never recovered from that genocide. And so as we correct societal problems, one, it's good to correct them early so it doesn't get to the point where people are so disgusted that they're willing to do terrible things. Because once that process gets started, it's almost impossible to stop. And you see this throughout history of things slowly getting worse and worse and worse and worse until finally that disgust triggers. It's almost like a civilizational safety mechanism. It's like the red flashing light. And it leads to a very, very terrible solution, a final solution that's not a solution at all. So be careful with your writing. Be careful with your cultural changes that you bring about. And write good books. Because that also doesn't mean not to write, right? Because if you're not going to write the book, somebody else is going to write the books, and that may be worse, right? So write books that make good changes.